The widower found her face down in the snow, fingers clawed into frozen earth like she was trying to dig her way to something cleaner. Her lips moved, not prayer, not pleading, just 3 words repeated until her breath thinned to nothing. "I'm broken goods." Samuel Pike stood over her with wind tearing at his coat, cattle lowing somewhere behind the white wall of storm, and he made a choice that would crack open the loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor. He dragged her inside. The blizzard had been building for 2 days, the kind of winter storm that didn't just cover the land, it erased it. Snow didn't fall so much as attack, horizontal and vicious, turning the open plains into a white hell where direction meant nothing and survival meant less. Fences disappeared. The barn became a gray ghost. The world beyond Samuel's ranch didn't just vanish, it ceased to matter, reduced to wind that screamed through dead grass and cold that crept through every crack in the wood like judgment looking for a way in. Samuel Pike was 43 and spoke more words to his cattle than he had to any human in the last 2 years. His hands were scarred from work, his back bent slightly from carrying water through winters that seemed longer each time, and his face held the kind of stillness that comes from grief left alone too long. He moved through his days with the precision of a man who had narrowed his life down to what could be controlled: frozen troughs, hay bales, the rhythm of survival. No expectations. No disappointments. No town. His wife had been dead 26 months, and the silence in the house had become something he could almost call companionship. He hadn't meant to go out that far. The cattle were secure, the barn door latched twice, and the storm was only getting meaner. But something, instinct, habit, or the ghost of a man he used to be, pulled him toward the property line where the fence met the road. That's where he found her. Mara Quinn had been running for 3 days before the storm swallowed her. City Saloon Girl, they called her, though the title carried more weight than her actual name ever did. The whispers followed her like a second shadow: spoiled, used, ruined, words that clung to her skin no matter how many times she scrubbed or how far she ran. She'd left town with nothing but the clothes she wore and a certainty that anywhere else had to be better than a place where men paid for her body and then made sure everyone knew she was worthless because of it. The storm caught her 10 miles out, and by the time she saw the outline of Samuel's ranch through the snow, her legs had stopped obeying and her mind had started whispering the same things the men used to say. Samuel didn't ask her name when he hauled her through the door. Didn't ask where she came from or why she was out there dying in his snow. He laid her near the fire, pulled off her frozen boots, and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he carried a wool coat, heavy, well-made, lined with rabbit fur, and draped it over her shaking body without a word. It had been his wife's. He hadn't touched it in 2 years. Mara's eyes opened slowly, focused on swimming, and when she finally saw him standing there, tall, silent, expressionless, she said it again, louder this time, like a confession she needed him to hear. "I'm broken goods." Samuel Pike looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post or a sick calf, practical, measuring, without sentiment. Then he said the only thing that mattered. "You're breathing. That's not broken." The fire cracked and spit embers while Mara pulled the dead woman's coat tighter around her shoulders. She didn't know whose it had been, didn't ask, but the weight of it felt like borrowed time, like wearing someone else's second chance. Samuel moved through the small house with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to his own company, setting a pot of water to boil, checking the draft on the stove, his boots leaving wet tracks across floorboards that had forgotten the sound of more than one person breathing. Outside, the storm hammered against the walls with fists made of ice and wind, sealing them in like the world had decided they needed to answer for something. Mara watched him work. No questions. No judgment in his eyes when he glanced her way. Just the methodical attention of someone keeping another human alive because that's what you did when winter tried to kill them on your land. It unnerved her more than anger would have. She knew what to do with anger. Anger made sense. Anger she could predict, negotiate, survive. This quiet competence, this absence of expectation, left her with nothing to brace against. "Why'd you bring me in?" she asked finally, voice still rough from cold and the kind of exhaustion that lived in bones. You don't know me. Samuel didn't look up from the pot. The storm would have killed you. Didn't seem like a thing that needed knowing you first. She almost laughed. Almost. Most men want to know what they're saving before they decide it's worth the trouble. Most men talk too much. He poured hot water into a tin cup, dropped in a handful of dried herbs that smelled like earth and bitterness, and handed it to her without ceremony. Medicine, maybe. Or just warmth. She wrapped her hands around it and felt the heat work its way into fingers that had forgotten what heat was. I worked in a saloon, she said, the words coming out flat and deliberate, like laying cards on a table. In the city. Men paid for my company. Some paid more than the company. Does that make a difference to you? Samuel finally looked at her fully, his eyes the color of winter sky, pale, unreadable. Difference to what? To whether you think I'm worth the firewood. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound was the wind trying to tear the roof off and the fire refusing to go out. When he spoke, his voice carried no sermon, no pity, nothing but plain truth delivered like nails into wood. My wife made one mistake. One. Trusted the wrong man when I was gone for cattle season, and he made sure the whole town knew what happened before I got back. They called her things I won't repeat. Whispered when she walked to the store. Crossing the street to avoid her shame was something you could catch. She hanged herself in the barn 2 years ago, and not one of those righteous sons of bitches came to the funeral. Mara's fingers tightened on the cup. The coat suddenly felt heavier. So no, Samuel continued, his tone unchanged, unbending. What you did to survive in a city that probably gave you no better options doesn't make a damn bit of difference to whether you're worth warmth and shelter. The people who taught you to believe it does, they're the ones not worth the firewood. She stared at him, searching for the crack, the angle, the moment when this turned into something else. But his face remained stone, his posture unchanged, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mara Quinn didn't know what to say. Outside, the blizzard screamed louder, as if the world itself was offended by his decency. By the second day, the storm had buried the windows halfway up and turned the world into a tomb made of white. The only proof that anything existed beyond the four walls was the constant howl of wind and the occasional crack of ice-heavy branches breaking somewhere in the distance. Samuel moved through the house like a ghost with purpose, checking the fire, rationing the food stores, melting snow for water, while Mara watched from the corner he'd given her, still wrapped in a dead wife's coat, still trying to understand the math of a man who saved her without wanting anything in return. The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. Mara had spent years in rooms full of noise, laughter that wasn't real, music that covered up transactions, conversations designed to extract money or dignity or both. Quiet meant something was wrong. Quiet meant someone was deciding what you were worth. But Samuel's quiet was different. It wasn't a calculation. It was just the natural state of a man who had stopped expecting the world to be anything other than cold. You talk to yourself, she asked on the second afternoon, watching him measure out coffee grounds like a prospector weighing gold. Sometimes. What do you say? Mostly reminders. Feed the cattle. Check the water. Don't go to town. She almost smiled. That last one needs reminding. Samuel paused, considering the question with more weight than it probably deserved. Every day for 2 years. The coffee boiled bitter and black, the kind that tasted like punishment, and they drank it without complaint because warmth was warmth and the storm wasn't offering better options. Mara studied him over the rim of her cup, the way his jaw worked when he was thinking, the careful distance he kept, the way his eyes never lingered on her body the way every other man's did. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something she couldn't name. You blame them? She asked. The town? For killing her? Yes. But she's the one who, Mara stopped herself, but it was too late. The words had shape now, hanging in the air between them like smoke. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went colder. She's the one who what? Made a mistake. Trusted someone. That's worth dying for in your estimation. No. I didn't mean. They killed her slowly. His voice stayed level, factual, like he was describing the weather. Not with a rope, they just made sure she understood every single day that her life didn't matter anymore. That one bad decision erased everything else she'd ever been or done. Made her invisible except when they wanted to remind her she was still visible enough to punish. You know what that does to a person? When the whole world agrees you're garbage? Mara's throat tightened. She knew exactly what it did. I couldn't stop it, Samuel continued. Couldn't make them see her any differently. Couldn't fight a whole town's need to feel righteous by destroying someone smaller. So yeah, I blame them. And I blame myself for not taking her somewhere else when I had the chance. The fire popped. Wind rattled the door like something trying to get in. Mara set down her cup and spoke quietly, the confession coming out before she could stop it. The city taught me that my body was the only thing I had worth trading. And then it taught me that trading it made me worthless. They pay you and despise you in the same breath. You survive it by believing you deserve it. Samuel looked at her then, really looked, and his voice came out rougher than before. You don't. 2 words. But they hit like an axe splitting frozen wood. The third day, survival stopped being theoretical and became work. The storm hadn't let up, if anything, it had grown meaner, the kind of cold that found every gap in the walls and settled into your chest like it planned to stay. The cattle needed water. The fire needed wood. The snow needed clearing from the door before it buried them permanently. Samuel moved with the grim efficiency of someone who had done this alone too many times, and Mara, restless from sitting still and tired of feeling like cargo, stood up and followed him. You don't have to, Samuel said, pulling on gloves that were more whole than leather. I'm not helpless. Didn't say you were. Said you don't have to. What else am I going to do? Sit by the fire and feel grateful? Something almost like amusement crossed his face. Most people would. I'm not most people. Noticed. They worked in silence, passing each other in the narrow spaces between stove and door, barn and house, the rhythm of it becoming something almost comfortable. Mara hauled wood while Samuel broke ice from the water troughs with an axe, each swing precise and practiced. She watched the way his shoulders moved under his coat, the way he spoke low words to the cattle like they were children, the way he checked the barn walls for weak points with hands that knew every inch of this place. He had built a life here out of grief and stubbornness, and it showed in every corner. Inside, they ate in silence, salt pork and beans, bread gone hard at the edges, coffee that tasted like dirt, and the meal felt more honest than any Mara had eaten in the saloon, where everything came with a price and nothing was ever just food. Samuel offered her the better portion without comment. She took it without argument. The exchange felt like a language neither of them had words for yet. That night, the cold turned vicious. The fire burned low despite Samuel's best efforts, and the wind found every crack, every seam, every weakness in the wood. Mara wrapped herself in the coat and 2 blankets and still shivered hard enough her teeth clacked together. Samuel watched her from across the room, his face unreadable in the firelight, before finally speaking. You'll freeze over there. I'm fine. You're not. And I'm not explaining to whatever law comes through here why I let a woman freeze 6 feet from a fire. He dragged his bedroll closer to the hearth, positioned it so his back faced the flames, and gestured for her to sit in front of him. Mara hesitated, every instinct screaming that this was the moment, the shift, the price finally coming due. But Samuel just sat down, solid as a fence post, and waited. She sat. Carefully. Keeping space between them. Closer, he said. Heat doesn't work through cold air that cold. She shifted back until her spine nearly touched his, and the warmth from his body hit her like something physical. He didn't move. Didn't reach for her. Didn't even adjust his position to get closer. Just sat there, breathing steady, a wall of warmth between her and the killing cold, and for the first time since the saloon, Mara felt something other than dread when a man was close enough to touch her. This doesn't mean anything, she said quietly, needing to establish the terms, needing to know where the boundaries were. Samuel's voice came from behind her, low and certain. Never thought it did. They sat like that through the frozen night, back to back, two people staying alive through proximity and nothing more, while the storm raged and the world tried to kill them and neither one of them touched the other even once. The fourth morning arrived gray and merciless, the storm showing no signs of mercy or exhaustion. Mara woke with her back still pressed against Samuel's, his breathing deep and even, and for a confused moment she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept through a full night without waking to check exits or count money or brace for whatever came next. The realization unsettled her more than the cold ever could. Samuel was already up by the time she'd pulled herself fully awake, moving through morning tasks with the mechanical precision of someone who had stopped expecting mornings to be anything but work. She joined him without discussion, falling into the pattern they'd established, him breaking ice, her hauling wood, both of them moving around each other like dancers who'd learned the steps without music. But something had shifted. The silence felt heavier now, weighted with things neither of them was saying. Mara caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, trying to find the angle, the want, the moment when his decency would crack and show her what he really expected. It never came. He treated her the same as he treated the cattle, necessary, worth keeping alive, deserving of basic care. It should have been insulting. Instead, it was the most respect anyone had shown her in 5 years. "Why'd you stay?" she asked that afternoon, both of them sitting near the fire with tin cups of coffee that had been reheated 3 times. "After she died. Why stay on a ranch this far from anything?" Samuel stared into his cup like it held answers. "Where else was I going to go?" "Anywhere. City. Another territory. Somewhere the memories aren't in every corner. Memories are the only thing I got left of her that the town didn't ruin." He looked up then, his eyes carrying something raw and unguarded. "And besides, running just means you take the worst parts with you anyway. Learned that much." Mara felt the words land like stones in her chest. "Why do you think I'm running? Aren't you?" She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't know anything about her, but the truth sat between them too obvious to deny. "The city made me understand something," she said finally, voice tight. "Every man who paid me, everyone who smiled and called me pretty and then left money on the table like I was no different than the whiskey, they were all teaching me the same lesson. That wanting things, needing things, being a woman with a body, that's the crime. Not what they did. What I am." Samuel's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "That's not a lesson. That's a lie they tell so they don't have to feel like bastards. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. You hear something enough times, it becomes true anyway." "No." The word came out sharp, harder than anything he'd said before. "It becomes what you believe. That's different." "Is it?" Mara's voice rose despite herself. "Your wife believed what they said about her. Believed it enough to." She stopped, but the damage was already done. Samuel stood abruptly, his cup clattering to the floor. For a moment, Mara thought he'd yell, maybe throw her out into the storm, finally show the anger she'd been waiting for. Instead, his voice came out quiet and fractured. "She believed it because I didn't fight hard enough to make her believe something else. Because I thought love and a roof were enough against a town that wanted blood. I was wrong. And she's dead because I was wrong." The fire cracked. The wind screamed. And Mara realized with sudden, terrible clarity that Samuel Pike wasn't keeping his distance because he judged her. He was keeping his distance because he was terrified of failing someone again. The fifth day broke with a thin crack of sunlight through the eastern window, the first real light they'd seen since the storm began. The wind had finally exhausted itself into something merely bitter instead of lethal, and the snow had stopped falling like the sky had run out of ammunition. Samuel stood at the window for a long time, studying the white wasteland that used to be his property, calculating distances and danger with the practiced eye of someone who had survived too many winters to trust a momentary break in the weather. "Storm's dying," he said, not looking at her. "Roads might be passable in a day or two." Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with temperature. "Does that mean you want me gone?" "Means you'll be able to leave if you want to." The distinction felt important, though she couldn't quite say why. She watched him pull on his coat, preparing to check the cattle, and the routine that had felt almost comfortable now felt like something ending before it had properly begun. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and spoke without turning around. "You don't have to decide now." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in a house that still smelled like coffee and would smoke in the particular loneliness of two people learning each other's damage. Mara spent the day preparing to leave. Not because Samuel had asked her to, he hadn't, but because staying felt like accepting something she didn't know how to accept. She folded the blankets she'd used, tidied the corner that had become hers, tried to figure out how to give back the dead wife's coat without making it mean more than it did. Every movement felt like closing a door she hadn't realized was open. Samuel came back at dusk, snow crusted on his shoulders, his face red from wind and work. He looked at the neat stack of blankets, at Mara standing in her own thin jacket with the wool coat folded in her arms, and something in his expression went carefully blank. "You're leaving. Roads clearing. Like you said." "I said it might be passable. Didn't say it was safe. Been walking unsafe roads my whole life. I'll manage." Samuel stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floor, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain. Not angry. Not disappointed. Just lost, like a man watching something slip away that he didn't know how to hold on to. "Why?" The question came out rough. "Storm's not done. You got no supplies. No destination I've heard you mention. Why leave now?" "Because I know how this ends." Mara's voice cracked despite her best efforts. "You've been kind. Kinder than anyone's been in longer than I can remember. But I've seen kindness turn before. Seen men who start out decently convince themselves that because they were good to you, you owe them something. And I can't," she stopped, the words tangling. "I can't watch you turn into one of them. I'd rather leave now and remember you as someone different." Samuel flinched like she'd struck him. "You think that's what I'm doing?" Being decent so you'll, he couldn't finish it, the thought too ugly to complete. "Jesus, Mara. Is that what you think of me?" "I don't know what to think of you." Her voice rose, years of survival instinct finally breaking through. "You don't want anything. You don't ask for anything. You just keep being kind, and I don't know what that costs or when the bill comes due, and I can't afford to wait and find out." The silence that followed felt like the space after thunder, charged and dangerous. Samuel's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "It doesn't cost anything. That's what I've been trying to show you." The coat slipped from Mara's hands and hit the floor between them like a body. Neither of them moved to pick it up. Samuel stood in the doorway, snow melting into dark spots on the wood, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles no one else could see. Outside, the wind had died to nothing, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. "You want to know why I kept my distance?" Samuel's voice came out raw, stripped of the careful control he'd maintained for days. "Why I didn't sit too close, didn't touch you, didn't," he stopped, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "It wasn't because I thought you were broken or used or any of the goddamn things those men told you. It was because I was terrified. Mara stared at him, her chest tight. Terrified of what? Of being like them. The words came fast now, like a dam breaking. Of wanting you and having you mistake it for the same thing every other bastard wanted. Of taking something from you just because I could, because you were here and vulnerable and maybe felt like you owed me for not letting you freeze. I've seen what that looks like. Watched my wife get destroyed by a man who thought kindness bought him ownership. I will not, his voice cracked. I will not be that. Not to you. Not to anyone. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Mara felt something breaking open in her chest, painful and necessary, like a wound that had been sealed over infection. So you stayed away, she said quietly. You kept yourself cold because you thought wanting me would make me just another man taking from what the world already took from. Samuel's eyes met hers finally, and they were full of a grief that had nothing to do with his dead wife. You said they taught you your body was a crime. Well, they taught me that loving someone, wanting someone, makes you the enemy. Makes the whole town turn on you. Makes decent people into monsters if you're not careful. And I couldn't, he stopped, his throat working. I couldn't risk making you feel like you had to give me anything. Not after everything you've already had taken. Mara's vision blurred. You stayed distant to protect me. I stayed distant to protect both of us. She took a step toward him, then another, the distance between them shrinking until she could see the gray starting at his temples, the lines around his eyes, the absolute terror in his expression that she might misunderstand what he was trying to say. They taught me my body was a crime, she said, her voice shaking but steady. Taught me that desire was always debt. That being wanted meant being used. That no man would ever see past what I'd done to survive. Samuel's jaw clenched. Mara. But you did. The words came out fierce, angry, true. You saw past it without even trying. You looked at me like I was just a person. Someone worth keeping alive not because of what I could give you, but because letting someone die in the snow is wrong. That's it. That's all it was. That's all it ever had to be. And they taught you, Mara continued, stepping closer still, that loving someone makes the town your enemy. That caring about a woman who's made mistakes turns decent people into a mob. That the price of wanting someone the world's already condemned is watching them die from shame while you stand there helpless. Samuel nodded, unable to speak. The coat lay between them on the floor, forgotten. The storm had passed. The world outside was nothing but white and silence and the promise of a thaw that would come whether they were ready or not. So what do we do? Mara whispered. Two people taught all the wrong lessons by all the wrong teachers. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way a man studies a map before deciding which direction might lead somewhere worth going. Then he bent down, picked up the coat, and held it out to her, not as a command or an offering, but as a simple choice placed in her hands. We start by you deciding if you want to stay, he said. Not because you owe me. Not because the storm made you. Not because you think leaving makes you stronger or staying makes you weak. Just, do you want to stay? Mara took the coat, her fingers brushing his for the first time since he'd pulled her from the snow. The touch was brief, accidental, and neither of them pulled away like it burned. I don't know how to stay without it costing something, she admitted. Every place I've ever been, staying had a price. Then we figure it out together. One day at a time. No debt. No transaction. Just two people trying not to freeze to death and maybe learning how to be less alone. She looked at the coat in her hands, then at the small house that had become a shelter against more than just weather, then back at Samuel Pike, this quiet widower who had somehow seen past every lie the world had told about her and decided she was worth saving anyway. They'll talk, she said. If I stay, if anyone finds out what I was. Let them talk. They talked about my wife until it killed her. They can talk about us until they run out of breath. The difference is, this time I'm not letting their poison into my house. This time I know what they are. And what's that? Cowards who need someone to be lower than them so they can feel tall. Mara almost smiled. Almost. You really think we can do this? Build something here while the whole world thinks we're both damned? I think the world's opinion stopped mattering to me the day I buried my wife. And I think you've survived worse than small-town gossip. He paused, his voice softening. But I also think if you leave now, you should leave because you want to. Not because you're scared of what staying might mean. She stood there in the middle of his house, wearing a dead woman's coat, holding the weight of every bad decision and worse circumstance that had led her to this moment, and made a choice that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that maybe, she deserved something other than punishment. I'll stay, she said quietly. Not forever. I'm not promising forever. But, for now. If you'll have me. I'll have you. The words hung in the air, simple and enormous, a promise made without conditions or fine print. Samuel didn't move closer. Didn't try to seal it with touch or gesture. Just stood there, solid as the walls around them, and let her understand that this was what staying meant, two damaged people choosing proximity without pressure, building something careful and slow out of honesty and shared work and the radical notion that kindness didn't require repayment. That night they sat back to back by the fire again, warmth passing between them like a language neither had to speak. Outside, the first thaw began, water dripping from the eaves like a slow clock counting down to spring. The ranch still stood lonely against the horizon, miles from town, miles from judgment, miles from the world that had tried to break them both. But inside, for the first time in longer than either could remember, two people discovered that maybe, just maybe, they had never been as broken as they'd been taught to believe. And that was enough to start with. That was more than enough. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more tales from the Wild West where broken people find redemption in the most unexpected places, subscribe and hit that notification bell. There's always another story waiting in the dust. Thanks for listening.